So, Prodigy of Mobb Deep has been It's been reported that he has died. Now, he died on June 20th, 2017. Now, the apparent cause of death are complications from sickle cell disease. Now, Prodigy of Mobb Deep, he's suffered from sickle cell disease or sickle cell anemia for a long time. If you go back, there was a song that Tupac had a song back in the 1990s, back when Tupac had beef with a lot of rappers from New York City. He said something about Prodigy. I think it was on Hit 'Em Up. I have to go check. I can't remember, but it was Tupac said something about Prodigy having sickle cell. He said he said something about Prodigy needs to relax. He might get a seizure and die or something like that. I think it was on Hit 'Em Up at the end of the song when he's saying stuff about all these different people. So anyway, so Prodigy of Mobb Deep, he's died, and it seems to be from sickle cell. Now I knew he had sickle cell, but he seemed to be okay. I don't know that much about how the disease works, but Prodigy of Mobb Deep, they said he had the sickle cell, and then he seemed okay. And so I guess without treatment, people with sickle cell anemia, they just die very quick. They don't live very long. But they have all these treatments and medications or whatever they do. They can keep people alive for longer now if they get the treatment. So I didn't expect him to just die like that. I thought he was okay. I thought he would be okay. There's another person who has sickle cell, is T-Boz from TLC. She also has sickle cell. I'm not sure how she's doing, but anyway, so I didn't expect him to die. It's kind of surprising that he just died like that suddenly. But anyway, so rest in peace to Prodigy. Now, this is on the side. This is kind of a tangent, but this whole sickle cell thing. If you look at the origins of sickle cell, there are people who, you hear these people, you see them a lot on the internet, these people who say that black people are not descended from Africans, okay? But the sickle cell disease, that's a genetic legacy of Africans. The reason that sickle cell is relatively common among people of African descent in the Americas, black Americans, is that sickle cell protects against malaria. So in Africa, in some parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, or a lot of Sub-Saharan Africa, they had a lot of malaria. I guess they still have a lot of malaria. And they have malaria used to be common all over the world. It was in Europe, it was in England, the Netherlands, Canada, the United States, all over Asia. It was everywhere, almost everywhere. But there's different strains of malaria. So malaria is caused by these little tiny animals that go in people's bloodstreams. They're spread by mosquitoes. Mosquitoes bite somebody, they pick up these little tiny microscopic animals, protozoa. They pick up the protozoa, then they bite somebody else, they inject the protozoa into the bloodstream, they multiply in your bloodstream, you get sick. So anyway, so there's different species of these protozoa, and there's certain kinds that cause worse disease than other ones. So the most dangerous, most deadly type of protozoa is called falciparum, and that is most common in Sub-Saharan Africa, tropical Sub-Saharan Africa. So this disease, and malaria was very common. Basically, every single person, every single child in Africa got falciparum malaria. Every single one of them in tropical Africa. Every single kid got the malaria. I read somewhere that the infection rate in, I think it was Zambia, they said the infection rate was over 100%, and I was thinking, how could you have an infection rate of over 100%? But what it was people were getting infected multiple times a year. So basically, you have people in Africa, at least in the past. I don't know about now. I don't know how much they've eliminated malaria in some places, or in some areas, but in the past, just about every single person in tropical Africa caught malaria. So basically, they had this deadly form of malaria, so everybody catches it, and it killed a lot of children. And I think when people got infected, they eventually developed a kind of immunity to it, or resistance. They would have I think people would have malaria, and then some people would have the protozoa, the little animals in their blood, but after a while they wouldn't get sick anymore, so they couldn't really get infected anymore. So if you survived, I think it killed maybe half the children who were born would die from malaria, but the ones who didn't die would eventually get resistance. So so they would have the malaria parasites in their body, but they wouldn't be getting sick. And if they got bitten by a mosquito again that carried malaria, they wouldn't get sick anymore. They would have basically have resistance. But because the malaria killed so many people, it created a situation where people who had some type of resistance to the malaria before they got infected would have an advantage, because they would, in terms of getting older and having children, they wouldn't, if somebody had a resistance, a genetic resistance to malaria, they would not get infected and die as children, unlike people who didn't have resistance. So that takes us back to the thing that Prodigy has, the sickle cell. This is why so many African Americans have the sickle cell now, because sickle cell is a genetic mutation in some type of weird blood type that provides protection against malaria infection. For some reason, the malaria parasites can't really feed on the blood of people who have the sickle cell trait. Now, everybody who has a sickle cell trait with these weird mutant genes, they don't have actual sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease. Sickle cell disease happens when you have two parents who have the sickle cell gene. They have a child, and then the child gets the sickle cell anemia. But if somebody only gets the sickle cell gene from one parent, they're okay. They don't have the sickle cell disease, and they have the sickle cell trait, which protects them from malaria. So they're more likely to live to get older and have children. So that's how the sickle cell increases, because the people who didn't have the sickle cell trait in tropical Africa, they're more likely to get malaria as children and die before they're old enough to have children. Whereas the ones who have the sickle cell trait, they get bitten by the mosquito, but the parasites can't really infect them properly, so they live they get older, they live long enough to have children, then they pass on those sickle cell genes. So this is why West Africa had the highest rate of sickle cell trait in the world. Now, there's other places in the world that also had sickle cell. Southern Europe, India, Middle East, some people have the sickle cell trait as well. And for the same reason, because you have malaria. But in tropical Africa, you had the highest rates of sickle cell because you had the highest rates of infection with the most deadly form of or strain of malaria. So anyway, so fast forward, when you take people from West Africa, take them to America, a lot of them have those sickle cell genes. So this is why you have these high rates of sickle cell anemia among African Americans, and that's why you have people like Prodigy, T-Boz from TLC, and so on, who have the sickle cell disease among African Americans. So that's an example of why it's ridiculous when people say that Black Americans are not descended from Africans. Why it's ridiculous? That's a direct genetic link. And there's other issues like, for example, I mean, there's people from Africa. I've seen people from Africa who I thought, I didn't know they were from Africa. I thought they were from, or their parents were immigrants or whatever. I didn't know that. I thought that they were from the Americas. So I remember there was a guy who I guess he grew up. He didn't grow up in Africa. He didn't talk like, he wasn't a recent immigrant. He didn't have a African accent or anything. So I didn't know he was he came from an African background. Okay, I thought he was a Black person from the Western Hemisphere, a person of African descent from the Western Hemisphere. So anyway, that's what I assumed. And then there was a immigrant from Ghana, and of course, when somebody's an immigrant, you can tell because of they talk differently, they may act differently. You can tell. It's easy to tell when somebody's an immigrant. Okay, so anyway, this immigrant guy from Ghana, he met this other guy who I didn't know came from a Ghanaian background, and then they started talking, and the guy who I didn't know was Ghanaian said, or didn't know came from a Ghanaian background, he said he's from Ghana. The two guys started talking, and then they found out, oh, they're from the same tribe, and they started talking their language. But the thing is, based on physical appearance, I couldn't tell that the other guy who wasn't an immigrant, or who wasn't a recent immigrant, who didn't have an accent, I couldn't tell he was Ghanaian, or he came from a Ghanaian background. I assumed he was a Western Black person, or a Western person of African descent. But anyway, so I've seen people mistake. People can't always tell who somebody is from Africa, or they're from the United States, or from the Caribbean. So it's because they look the same, because they have the same genetic background. And that the whole sickle cell thing is just an example of that. So anyway, so my point is that it's ridiculous when people talk about African Americans aren't from Africa and all this stuff. Why? I don't know. I don't understand how they could say that. The people, even now, a lot of African Americans are racially mixed, but you take people who aren't mixed too much, they look the same as West Africans. You can't even tell the difference. So anyway, so rest in peace to Prodigy. But the whole thing about people are not, or African Americans are not descended from Africans is ridiculous.